Welcome to Doctors at Work. My name's Matt Daniel, and this podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. Today, I'm having a discussion with Dr. Valerie Young, who is a world thought leader on imposter syndrome. She tells me that imposter syndrome is about feeling that you are not as good as others, attributing your successes to external factors, and a pervasive fear of being found out. It's common in healthcare professionals, linked at least partially to the fact that stakes are high in our jobs and our culture of criticising each other. Dealing with imposter syndrome requires recognition that it is common and normalising its presence. It requires reframing to a humble realist response, where people have a realistic appraisal of their skills and a healthy response to feedback. And it requires separation of feelings of confidence from actual competence. The two are not the same, and thinking and acting competent is likely to come before one feels confident. Welcome, Valerie. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. Well, I have been in this kind of space or area of imposter syndrome for a very long time, ever since I was a doctoral student and heard about it many, many years ago, and went on to do some research and created the first educational intervention to the topic. And then from there, I've spoken at lots of universities, over 100 around the world, and corporations, and I'm the co-founder of Imposter Syndrome Institute currently.
Okay. What is imposter syndrome?
The original terminology, Matt, was imposter phenomenon, and the term was coined by two clinical psychologists, Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes. It wasn't based on a study. I want to say it was based on their observations of women in one-on-one therapy and in kind of growth awareness groups that they were facilitating. And basically what they found is this kind of prevalent, often unconscious sense that we're really not as intelligent, capable, competent, talented, qualified as everyone seems to think we are. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but we have this belief, despite concrete, tangible evidence of our past accomplishments and our abilities. But what happens is we externalize them, and then as a result, we're left with this fear of being exposed, unmasked, found out.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, is that sort of a good thing or a bad thing? Because, if all the time you're thinking, do I need to learn? Do I need to develop? Do I need to double check? Do I need to reflect? Do I need to ask for help? Some of those things may be quite useful, but I can see on the other hand, sort of if you're self-sabotaging or if you're not stepping forwards, I can see that being problematic. So, where's the line between the useful type of reflection and insight and the problematic imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, I think self-reflection is always a good thing. Learning from challenges and mistakes is always a good thing. I am not a fan of what I consider to be kind of the rebranding of imposter syndrome as a positive, as a good thing. And
Okay.
here's the reasons, Matt. One is, I think, as you said, there's this, which I get, I understand the sentiment, right? The sentiment is, it's really okay. It's a good thing because it means you're growing and learning. My pushback is, do we have to feel inadequate and do we have to feel like frauds to be growing and learning? I don't think so. The other argument is that it motivates us to work harder. The research shows that women are less likely to be propelled by self-doubt. So it may work for some people as a motivator, but not everyone. And I could say personally, I don't want my motivation to work hard to come from trying to outrun the no talent police. The other reason they say it's a good thing is that it keeps us humble. And in the 4 decades I've been doing this work, I have yet to hear a single woman say, I think I'm going to keep my insecurity and self-doubt and imposter feelings because it keeps me humble. Hubris is more just culturally more of a male issue. And so I think it's a false choice that we're being given, this idea that you can be an arrogant jerk or you can keep your imposter syndrome. And I'm trying to navigate a third, I think, a healthier choice, which is to become what I call a humble realist.
Okay, so it feels like we need to spend some time here because I think this is kind of a very different way of thinking for me. And so if I kind of think, let's say we've got somebody who's trying to learn a procedure, and they do it's a trainee and they do a technical procedure, and it perhaps sort of doesn't go necessarily to plan. then so what you're saying is that the third way is, okay, I'm learning, I'm training, I didn't do this sort of as well as it could be, and sort of, and here's the things that I need to do, but I recognize that, this is reality and that's how I'm learning, as opposed to maybe, the version of imposter syndrome that I've outlined, which would have gone along the lines of, I'm terrible, I'm no good, I'm inadequate, I can't do that.
Right. Right.
And then trying to use that as a motivator. And actually, I can see how that wouldn't be particularly motivating.
Yeah, it's interesting because the more recent research is that up to 82% of people have these feelings. But let's take the number that's always thrown around more conservatively, let's say 70% of people.
Yeah.
My question is, like, what's up with the other 30? Right? Why are we studying them? And some part of that 30, they do have kind of irrational self-confidence syndrome, right? Where their belief in their knowledge and skills far exceeds their actual knowledge and skills. But there's a minority within that minority, which is the first person that you described, right? Who, I mean, because they're no more intelligent, capable, competent, talented than folks who have imposter feelings. Just like in that situation that you described, they're thinking different thoughts.
Okay.
They have a healthy response to failure, mistakes, setbacks, and constructive feedback, which if you're in medicine, all you're getting is critical feedback usually.
Yeah.
They have a realistic understanding of what it means to be competent, and they understand a certain amount of fear and self-doubt is kind of part of the achievement journey. So yeah, they would go, wow, I didn't do very well at that. I guess clearly I need to work harder. I need to get, more mentoring. I need to practice more. It's kind of like sports. Right? I mean, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to be crying on the bench. The losing team or the athlete doesn't hang up their uniform and say, I'm horrible, I can never play again, I'm out, right? They go watch the game tape, they get more coaching, and they practice, and they say, we'll get them next time.
Yeah. But I think in medicine, a lot of people do throw the toys out of the pram and hang up the kits and leave. And, and that may be, if it's learning a technical skill, obviously, if somebody's in a profession, they've got to do it. But a lot of people maybe in the beginning will say, oh, I'm no good at technical skills, therefore I won't do it. Or I'm no good at leading a ward round, therefore I'm going to choose something that doesn't involve a ward round. Or it might be sort of in leadership related stuff when, somebody will say, I'm no good at leading a meeting, I'm no good at chairing a department.
Right.
And then they leave. So
Right. And that's especially true in STEM. I find, young students, medical school, undergraduate school, they flunk one exam or one class, and they're like, well, clearly I'm not cut out for whatever this field is.
Yeah.
Without recognizing. I'll just tell you a quick story. There's a guy, Mike Massimino, who was a NASA astronaut. He wrote a wonderful book called Spaceman, all about his unlikely journey. Growing up, working class kid, went on to achieve his lifelong dream of becoming an astronaut. He talked about having imposter feelings on a podcast, right? So I read his book. When he was at MIT for his master's in engineering, he got a 12 on one exam. He got an 18 on another exam. He was crushingly disappointed. He almost dropped out. But instead, he got into a study group with other failing students. They were they were able to raise their grades together. Then he failed his qualifying exams to get the PhD. And again, he almost dropped out, and way too many students do drop out. But he got some practice, and people helped him and coached him through it. He did some more research, and he was able to pass. So when I met him at Columbia, I said, Mike, I don't think you had imposter syndrome. He said, you don't? I said, no, I think he had, holy crap, I'm going into outer space in a tin can syndrome. Because his entire response, Matt, was to me like humble realist thinking. Like, yeah, sometimes you fail, and that's real life. It's like, what are you going to do with that failure? That's what matters.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I think when I first became a consultant, which was 12 years ago, I probably spent the first 5 years of my career thinking, I can say that now because I'm out of it now. I spent thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing, and it's just a matter of time until they all find out. Is that kind of thinking, is that what shows up in imposter syndrome?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially in an area like consulting, where, it's kind of the kind of subjective standards around it. There's really no clear roadmap. You're addressing issues and understanding issues in real time, kind of live as you're doing it. And so a lot of people in big management consulting companies like KPMG and Deloitte and Pricewaterhouse, very common that these consultants have these imposter feelings.
Yeah. So, okay. And you said earlier that you talked about that this initially was found up in women. Is it just affect women, or does it affect men as well?
Yeah, the reason why they thought it was initially women is that's really who their pool that they were dealing with at the time, and just more informal conversations with men, they found certainly some men experienced it, but others kind of brushed it off as, yeah, but it's no big deal. Subsequent research is mixed. There are certainly studies that find really no differences. There was a study in Malaysia with medical students that found it slightly higher in male medical students in Malaysia. But then there's other studies that find it, usually like 20-25% higher in women. So it really just depends on the pool, maybe the field, the age group.
Mm-hmm.
But in my experience, it does hold women back more.
Mm-hmm. In what way does it hold women back, or anybody back?
Well, I think part of it is because, we can debate whether nature, nurture, I do see more of a hesitancy to move ahead if we don't know 150%. I think not just women, but when you belong to any group for whom there are stereotypes about competence or intelligence, you're probably going to gravitate towards, feeling like you need to know 150%, being a perfectionist, because you know that you kind of represent your entire group, and you don't want to be kind of called out as like the only woman in the room, or the only person of color in the room, or the person with the disability, or maybe you're the youngest person, the older person, right, who's underestimated based on age-related stereotypes.
And how does one know that they have imposter syndrome?
That's a great question, because there's so much misinformation on the internet, and that's where most people get their information. If you really want to understand it, you want to research imposter phenomena to get more, empirical data, as opposed to imposter syndrome, which you're going to get more, stuff in the popular field. But it's become synonymous with a lot of people with just kind of normal nervousness before a job interview, or making a presentation, or being confused. Or there was two women who went to a nudist hotel and they were uncomfortable in the lobby. And so they had imposter syndrome, they said. I'm like, no, you were naked in a hotel lobby. That's why you were uncomfortable. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means. I think the way to tell is, again, there's three pieces. Do I feel like I've fooled people? Do I genuinely think that I am not as intelligent, capable, competent, qualified as other people?
Mm-hmm.
Am I externalizing my accomplishments and chalking them up to things like luck or timing, or oh, they just like me? Connections, the simplicity, if I can do it, anybody can do it. So is that happening? And do I have this pervasive fear of being found out? If those three variables are operating, then yes, there's probably some imposter syndrome happening. But I want people to keep in mind, you can go to Pauline Clance's website, and she has a validated assessment. I think there's, I want to say 60 questions. I could be wrong, but basically, it's like a yes, no, or you add up the points. But basically, you can have very low levels, you can have moderate levels, or you can have very intense levels. And it's important to recognize that those are very different experiences if you're on the intense level versus, kind of a little blip on the screen.
I hope you're enjoying the show. Please click subscribe so you'll be notified when new episodes become available. This podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. You can be part of that mission too by forwarding this show to one person who you think might benefit from listening. Thank you. Now on with the show. And you've used the term syndrome, phenomenon. Is that interchangeable or historic? Is there a difference between the two things?
It depends who you ask, right? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an academic. I was recently asked to contribute a chapter to a book that was put out by the American Psychological Association. It's called The Imposter Phenomenon, and it's the first book that really covers the empirical research on it and makes recommendations for interventions. And they asked me to contribute. And first of all, I'm like, why do you want me to contribute? Because I'm not an academic and I'm not a clinician. And I didn't feel like an imposter. I want to be clear. Again, I didn't think I'm going to fool anybody. I didn't think I'm going to, anything like that. But it just seemed odd to me. But they found my work valuable and saw some thought leadership there. So I'm like, okay. But they wanted me to change the name of my chapter to imposter phenomena. And I said no. And the reason I said no is that I had the Library of Congress here in the US do a search, like, when did it change from phenomenon to syndrome? And really, it was in just a couple years after Clance and I coined the term. It started getting used, called syndrome. And if you're a psychologist or an academic, your frame of reference is the diagnostical statistical manual. That's where you go to look up diagnoses. For the rest of us, the frame of reference is the dictionary. And the dictionary, in addition to having a clinical description, also describes syndrome as a set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that constitute a pattern. That's how I'm using it. And I made the case that it is a just as legitimate use of the word syndrome as it is in diagnostic terms. But I know it's like nails on a chalkboard to that audience. So I did, throughout the book, I called it IP/IS.
Okay. Compromise. And you said that you developed an intervention program for imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. And let's kind of talk a little bit about, in practical terms, what can people do?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at the time, the entire focus was on clinical interventions, one-on-one therapy, things we can do in therapy. Because my degree is in education, I just instinctively took my findings from my own doctoral work and turned it into an educational intervention, essentially a one-day workshop. So it's really designed to give people three things: information. What is imposter syndrome? What is it not? It's not just a fancy term for low self-esteem. Importantly, where does it come from? And that's an important question, because on the psychology side, there's a lot of focus on like childhood wounds and looking at childhood dynamics. And certainly that is one source. And I encourage people to look at messaging that they got growing up and expectations. But there's more going on than if it's not one thing, it's your mother, right? We weren't all raised by the same family. We didn't all get the same messages. So I think we have to look at societal factors that contribute. I think we have to look at situational factors, like being a student in and of itself makes you far more likely to have imposter feelings than the general population, because your knowledge and intellect is literally being tested every day. People in certain fields are more vulnerable. People in creative fields, for one set of reasons, are more susceptible. People in STEM are more susceptible because they're a very information dense, rapidly changing fields, medicine being one of them, like where you feel like you should be able to keep up on everything when no human on the planet possibly could. Another variable is kind of the overall kind of industry organizational culture. And medicine and higher education both have cultures that fuel self-doubt. At universities, it's a culture of critique, where all you're being told is what you're doing wrong. No one's giving you any positive feedback. And that's in many ways true in medicine, especially in medical education, as it was kind of described by one Stanford medical student as a culture of shaming. So I'd like to tell you a quick story, given your audience, Matt. I did a podcast for the British Medical Journal, and there was a medical student just graduated, and I don't know what you call them in the UK, but she's like a resident, like a few years into her program of becoming, out there practicing as a physician. And they were lamenting the lack of positive feedback in medicine, that you work so hard, right? And all you're getting is critique. The medical student said, in the UK, the best you can do on your final exam is no concern. Right? We have no concern about you, which to us is very British. The point that I made to them was, that sucks, right? You're working so hard, you're getting no positive feedback. But on the other hand, I wanted them to understand, even though you didn't know this was the culture you were signing up for when you went into medicine, this is the culture you're in. And when you know that, you can do more contextualizing and less personalizing. you can kind of separate yourself from the larger cultural framework that's happening and recognize this is the reality. It's not just about me. So part of understanding all the societal, occupational, situational, family sources is for that exact reason, as an action step. When you're having a normal imposter moment, to kind of hit the pause button, zoom out, get the bigger picture, and say, well, yeah, I grew up working class. No one in my family's gone to university or medical school, and now I'm this, this big thing in the field of medicine. Like, why wouldn't I feel like an imposter?
Yeah. And I like that contextualizing, because I think that very much feels like the culture of healthcare, that, it's always looking for problems and always criticizing. I guess the interesting thing there also is that how all of us have it in our power to help everybody else, because, if 70% of us, have it to some extent, then, recognizing the power of not just giving people negative feedback, but of making a point of giving people positive feedback. And when we're designing sort of assessment outcomes, to have outcomes that are not just no concerns, because there are forms like that. I mean, I certainly fill forms like that on a regular basis, where the best you can get is no concerns. Yeah. So they very much exist.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, so I mean, I'm interested in what sort of people can do. So there's the background, the stuff that's influence, and sort of people can't do necessarily anything about that. There's something there about culture and how all of us can change culture, and I'm interested in ways of thinking. Can you tell me a
Yeah,
little bit more about what's different about how somebody with imposter syndrome thinks versus
absolutely. Yeah.
somebody who's recovered from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we can, I can really put it in terms of three tools. So the first one I described, everything we just talked about, I put under the umbrella of normalizing imposter syndrome.
Okay. Yeah.
And that is an actual step. And organizations can normalize it as well by talking about imposter syndrome in new student orientation, or new employee orientation, or just bringing it up in leadership meetings, or whatever that might be. Normalizing it, talking about it, is very, very important. The second one is I call it reframe, right? To step back and recognize, again, people who don't feel like imposters aren't more intelligent, capable, competent. It's just that in the exact same situation where we feel like an imposter, they're thinking different thoughts. But very specifically, it's not a pep talk, right? Which is, people lapse into that. You're like, you've got it, and you can do it, and you deserve to be here, like, all of which is true, but it's not going to move the needle in any lasting way. If all it took was a pep talk, there'd be no imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
People who are what I call humble realists, they think differently about three very specific things. They have a realistic understanding of what it means to be competent.
Yeah.
They have a healthy response to failure, mistakes, constructive feedback, and setbacks. And they understand that there are times when they're going to be afraid, or they're not going to feel confident. And a certain amount of fear and self-doubt is part of the achievement journey. In other words, they don't conflate competence and confidence, which a lot of folks with imposter syndrome do. They feel like, if I was really competent, I wouldn't even have these feelings, right? The fact that I have imposter feelings must prove I'm actually an imposter.
Mhm.
So the reframing is when you have, again, a normal imposter moment. I invite people to hit that mental pause button, but this time just take a second and become consciously aware of, what is the conversation going on in my head right now? And then how would a humble realist reframe that? And then the third step is to act just before basically, a lot of people are waiting to feel more confident before they take action, and instead, that's not how it works. Like, feelings are the last to change. So the
Yeah.
third tool is to keep going regardless of how you feel.
Yeah.
So let's say you walk into a room of people you don't know at some conference or some new workplace. The person with imposter feelings goes, oh my God, everyone here is brilliant. And the inference being, and I'm not. The humble realist walks in and go, wow, what a bunch of brilliant people in this room. I'm going to learn so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that distinction between confidence and competence, because I think that comes up a lot, certainly when it comes to practical skill, or operative skills. Lots of people don't feel confident, and they then fail to progress because that paralyzes them. So I
Right.
like,
Yeah, because they expect to, I came up with these kind of 5 ways people with imposter syndrome misinterpret and measure their competence. So the perfectionist, the expert, the natural genius, the soloist, and the superhuman. And it's that natural genius who is, their interpretation of competence is based on ease and speed. So they expect to pick things up very quickly, master things very quickly. And when they do have to struggle to understand something or get masterful and skillful, they judge themselves as less because they're assuming for everyone else it's easy, but because I'm not as capable or intelligent, it's harder for me.
yeah. And the other reality when it comes to training, certainly in surgery, is that everybody learns at different paces as well. So, that's an additional layer that means that the vast majority of people get there. It's just that, people learn at different paces. Yeah.
Yeah. And, well, you mentioned surgery. The thing that's different about medicine as well, Matt, is anytime you're dealing with health and safety, literally life or death, whether it's, developing pharmaceuticals or flying airplanes or what have you, there's going to be a real premium on things being perfect, and yet there is a difference between perfectionism and a healthy drive to excel. People with a healthy drive to excel, of course, they want the surgery to go perfectly, as does the patient.
Yeah.
But if something goes wrong, they, of course, they're not going to feel great about it. But the perfectionist is very self-deprivating, and it can be paralyzing, and it can cause all kinds of problems. But the person with a healthy drive to excel, they're going to step back. Okay, what went wrong? How do I do this differently? How are we going to learn from this quickly,
Yeah.
and go the next step?
Okay, I wonder if I could ask you to wrap up and maybe bring us to a close. I'm interested in hearing your summary. What would be your top tips?
Yeah, I would say the top tip is to recognize that the only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. So to change your thoughts first, even though you don't believe the new thoughts, act like somebody who did believe the new thoughts, and over time, the confidence will catch up, and the imposter feelings will subside.
Perfect. That's a great tip. Thank you very much.
Thank you.